They told him he wasn't on the list. They said he'd disrupt the order. But when the sunlight hit his medals, the parade and the town came to a complete stop. In a town that forgot his name, one man reminded them all what honor really looks like. And he did it without saying a single word. If you believe that true heroes don't need permission to be remembered, this story is for you. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the quiet moments that change everything. The 4th of July dawned bright over the small town of Ashbridge, a place where American flags lined porches and barbecues started before noon. The streets were already buzzing, families staking out spots with folding chairs and coolers, children running with sparklers, and high school bands warming up in front of the courthouse. It was parade day, the biggest event of the year. And for the first time in decades, Walter Jennings stood on the sidewalk, not the street. He held his old uniform coat folded over one arm, the weight of it heavier than he remembered. The fabric was faded, buttons a bit tarnished, but the medals still caught the light like quiet reminders of wars most people in this town only knew from textbooks. Walter hadn't worn it in years. He hadn't planned to, but this year felt different. Maybe it was the ache in his bones that morning. Or maybe it was the letter he found tucked in an old drawer. A note from a brother in arms who never came home, reminding him that remembrance isn't about pride. It's about presence. So he walked downtown with the coat under his arm, wearing his best shoes and a clean white shirt. He wasn't on the list of participants. No one had invited him. He just assumed, maybe foolishly, that there would be room for one more. When he approached the event coordinator, a young man in khakis with a clipboard and a Bluetooth headset, Walter gave a polite nod and said, "I'd like to walk with the veterans group, if there's still time to line up." The man barely looked up. "You part of Post 17? "No. I served in Vietnam. Marine Corps. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." The man blinked once, clearly unsure how to respond. Then, flipping through his papers, he said flatly, "Yeah, this year's lineup is all current members. We don't want to disrupt the order." Walter's lips parted slightly, but he didn't argue. He wasn't one for making scenes. "I won't be in the way. I just want to walk. That's all." The coordinator offered a practiced smile. "Sir, thank you for your service, but we're trying to keep things organized. We already had trouble with someone trying to join last year. Liability issues, you understand." He didn't understand. Not really. But Walter nodded anyway and stepped back, standing in the shade of the hardware store. He looked down at his coat, then up the street where a float full of waving high school cheerleaders rolled by. Behind them marched a polished group from the local ROTC. Sharp uniforms, pristine boots, eyes forward. They looked good. Real good. But none of them had seen war. Not yet. An old man stepped beside Walter, arms crossed, watching the parade with a knowing squint. "They didn't let you march?" Walter shook his head. "Said I wasn't on the list." The man scoffed softly. "Hell, you probably wrote the list." Walter gave a dry chuckle. "I'm not looking for applause. I just felt like being part of it again." The man patted his shoulder. "You already are, whether they see it or not." Walter nodded. But as he turned to leave, the wind shifted and caught the edge of his uniform coat. A little boy nearby saw the ribbons glint in the sun and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, look, that man's got medals." More children turned. A teenage girl in a marching band uniform pointed. An older woman reached for her husband's arm. The crowd didn't cheer. Not at first, but a silence spread, one of respect, like the hush before the national anthem. A local news cameraman, catching the shift in energy, turned his lens toward Walter. A police officer standing near the barricade stepped forward. "Sir, those your medals?" Walter looked down at the silver stars, the purple ribbon, the bronze cluster that had cost him half a squad and a piece of his soul. "Yes, they are." The officer didn't speak. He simply lifted the gate rope and nodded. "You belong in that street." Walter hesitated. His boots felt heavy, but not from the years. He looked down the parade line, where the ROTC commander had stopped the march and was watching him now. Then, with his coat in hand, Walter stepped onto the pavement and began to walk. Not with a band or a float, not behind a banner or with a formation, but alone. First, then someone clapped, then another. Soon, the crowd on both sides of Main Street was on its feet. Not shouting, not cheering, just standing. Hats removed, hands over hearts. The way they do when something sacred passes by. And for the first time in decades, Walter Jennings marched. Not because he was asked, not because he was approved, but because he was remembered. Walter's steps were slow but sure, his shoes making a soft tapping sound on the pavement that somehow felt louder than the marching band. The moment he passed the first row of bystanders, time seemed to shift. A child placed his hand on his chest without being told. An elderly woman whispered to her granddaughter, "That's what a real hero looks like." Cell phones were raised. Not in the frantic, attention-seeking way, but like people trying to preserve something sacred. Up ahead, the parade was still moving. The ROTC group had resumed their march. A local radio truck played patriotic music through its speakers. The cheerleaders were tossing tiny red, white, and blue footballs into the crowd. Life continued. The world didn't stop for Walter Jennings, not yet. But whispers followed him like a rising tide. At the corner of Birch and Main, Deputy Calvin Torres was watching the scene unfold. He'd grown up in Ashbridge, left to serve in Afghanistan, then returned with a steel plate in his shoulder and a quiet job directing traffic. When he saw Walter walking alone, holding his old uniform coat, something stirred in his gut. He leaned over to the coordinator with the clipboard, the same one who turned Walter away, and said, "You sure you told him no?" The young man looked confused. "He wasn't registered. Do you know who that is?" Torres asked. "No, should I?" Torres didn't answer. He stepped into the road, removed his hat, and turned to face Walter. No words, just a nod. Walter paused when he reached him. They hadn't seen each other in years, but that nod was enough. It was the kind of greeting soldiers give when they recognize a fellow who's earned their silence. Torres took 2 steps back and fell in beside him. A cop in uniform walking next to a veteran in civilian shoes. The effect was immediate. 2 more veterans emerged from the crowd, one in a wheelchair, another using a cane. They wheeled and walked toward Walter until they, too, joined the quiet march. No banner, no permit, no brass band, just boots, breath, and memory. Further down, a middle-aged man in khakis and sunglasses tapped on his earpiece, speaking to someone. "We've got a situation developing. There's a spontaneous formation forming behind the bands." A pause. "Yes, veterans. No, not on the list. But the crowd's responding." That was an understatement. Entire families were now standing. Children were pulling on their parents' arms, asking questions. Who is he? Why wasn't he marching at the start? Why does everyone look like they're about to cry? Halfway down Main Street, Walter adjusted the coat draped over his arm. He didn't need to wear it. The story was already on his chest, told by posture, breath, and the silent nods of strangers. Still, when he reached the intersection in front of the reviewing stand, where the mayor and parade sponsors sat, he stopped. Then, slowly, with the quiet dignity of someone who no longer feared attention, he slipped the coat on. 1 button, then 2, then the 3rd. By the 4th, the mayor had already risen to his feet. A former businessman, the mayor had shaken thousands of hands in his life, but none as firm as Walter Jennings' handshake from decades earlier, when Walter was asked to volunteer at a high school veterans panel. The mayor remembered. And now, seeing him step out in front of the crowd, he whispered something to his assistant and took off his hat. That's when it happened. The marching band, approaching the reviewing stand, slowed down. The drumline missed a beat. One by one, the players noticed the old man in uniform standing alone in front of the platform. Then the snare drummer tapped out a roll, a salute in rhythm. The rest of the band fell in line. Not in chaos, but in choreography only the heart could understand. They pivoted, just slightly, toward Walter. The music shifted. No longer the upbeat pop medley of earlier, but a slow, reverent version of "America the Beautiful." Walter didn't move. He stood tall, gaze steady, coat now fully buttoned. And as the music flowed around him like a wave breaking on a rock, someone in the crowd began to sing. Just one voice at first, then a few more, and suddenly half the town was singing. Singing for a man they didn't know, but instantly recognized. He had not stormed a hill today. He had not spoken a single word. And yet, somehow, Walter Jennings had taken a forgotten place in the middle of Main Street and turned it into hallowed ground. Not by force, but by memory, by dignity, by being exactly who he was when no one else expected him to be. Walter Jennings stood motionless as the anthem faded. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't weeping. But the lines etched across his face seemed to deepen under the weight of the moment, as though every scar, every ache, every memory had surfaced at once. The crowd that had once dismissed him now couldn't look away. Their applause had fallen silent, replaced by something rarer, reverence. At the edge of the crowd, a local news anchor slowly lowered her camera. She'd been filming fluff pieces all morning. Dogs in star-spangled sweaters, a local pie-eating contest. But this wasn't fluff. This was something real. Her voice cracked slightly as she whispered into the mic. "We're witnessing something extraordinary here today. An unregistered veteran has just rewritten the meaning of this parade." Back at the reviewing stand, Mayor Holloway stepped forward. He wanted to do something, anything, to acknowledge what he'd just seen. But words failed him. He looked to his aide, who mouthed, "Go to him." So the mayor descended the steps and approached Walter slowly, almost cautiously. He extended a hand. Walter looked down at it, then shook it. Still no words. The mayor's mouth opened as if to speak, but Walter gently raised his left hand, just slightly, signaling, "Not now." The mayor nodded, understanding more in that gesture than any prepared speech he could have given. He turned and signaled the bandmaster, who quietly instructed the next group to delay their entrance. This space now belonged to Walter. Across the street, two teenage boys who had laughed earlier, when Walter was turned away, now stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide. One of them pulled his phone from his pocket, but the other shook his head. "Don't film this," he said. "Just remember it." Further back, in the shade of a maple tree, a young woman named Sarah watched the entire scene unfold. She was visiting from Denver, staying with her aunt. She'd never heard of Walter Jennings, but something about his posture, his calm, his quiet gravity reminded her of her grandfather. A man who rarely spoke about the war, who always looked out windows like he was remembering things no one else could see. Sarah felt a sudden urge to know Walter's story. Not just what war he'd fought in, but what he'd carried home. Meanwhile, Walter finally began to walk again. Not down the parade route, but toward the crowd. Step by step, he moved toward the families, the children, the people who had first dismissed him, then risen to their feet. As he passed, some reached out, brushing his sleeve, not like fans but like people trying to connect with something bigger than themselves. A boy no older than 8 stepped forward and saluted him. Walter looked at him, not with a smile, but with a nod so full of pride and sorrow that it left the boy speechless. His mother whispered, "That was the most respectful thing you've ever done." Then, for the first time, Walter spoke. His voice was hoarse, gravelly, and low, like it came from deep inside a cave. "What you did," he said, "meant something." The boy nodded, too stunned to reply. Walter's eyes scanned the crowd. He could see something shifting in them, the beginning of understanding. Not just for him, but for all the forgotten veterans. For the ones who came home to parades that ended too quickly. For the ones who were told to move on. For the ones who wore their stories in silence because no one ever asked. Walter didn't want pity. He never had. But recognition, that was different. That was everything. And now, for the first time in a very long time, he felt it. Not in the clapping or the camera flashes, but in the stillness. In the way people looked at him like he mattered again. Behind him, someone began to play taps. Soft, slow, solemn. Walter paused. Then, standing a few feet away from the crowd, he turned to face the flag fluttering at the end of the street. And with all the strength in his aging bones, he saluted. Not for show. Not for himself. but for the men he marched beside years ago, the ones who weren't here today. And for the boy who had just saluted him, the one who someday might understand why it mattered. Long before the medals glinted in the sun, before the crowd's applause and the hush that fell over the town square, Walter Jennings had already fought the hardest battle of his life, the one no one ever sees. The one that starts when the uniform is folded away and the silence of home replaces the chaos of war. He lived alone on the edge of the county line in a one-story house with chipped paint and a flagpole that hadn't flown anything in years. His morning routine was unshakable. Coffee at 6, radio on low, a quiet walk out to the mailbox even if there was no mail. His neighbors called him the Colonel, though he never once corrected them. He was actually a sergeant. But there was something about the way he carried himself, shoulders always back, steps always deliberate, that made people assume he'd been in charge. He never said much, but he always listened, especially to the children in the neighborhood, the ones who biked past his house too fast or tried to sell him lemonade from uneven stands. He'd always stop, always drop a coin in the jar without taking the drink. One boy once asked him why. "You don't need to buy it if you don't want it," the boy had said. Walter replied, "I'm not buying the drink. I'm investing in your courage." He said it like a lesson, but with a hint of a smile, like someone who knew just how rare courage really was. That same boy, Jason, had grown up and become part of the town's parade committee. He remembered Walter, remembered how he never missed a parade but never participated either. So, this year Jason made sure Walter was on the list. He filed the request himself. But the request never made it to the right desk. On the morning of the parade, Jason was pulled away to handle a logistics issue. He never saw Walter get turned away. If he had, he would have stopped it. Walter had arrived early, as he always did. He wore a pressed white shirt, the medals pinned cleanly to his chest. His shoes shined like inspection day. He stood patiently in line behind the high school marching band and the city's antique fire engine, holding the folded invitation Jason had handed him days earlier. A laminated card marked, "Guest Veteran, Line 3. But the young coordinator at the gate had never seen it before. "I'm sorry, sir," she'd said. "Your name's not on the master list. Maybe there was a mistake." Walter didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, turned, and walked away. Behind him, the parade rolled on, unaware. He took the long way home, walking past the edges of the park and down Main Street, which would soon be packed with cheering crowds and waving flags. He walked with his hands behind his back, posture tall, heart heavy. But something made him stop. A store window reflected the flag banners lining the street, the folding chairs already claimed with jackets and bags, the kids chasing each other in red and blue. And in that reflection, he saw himself. An old man with too many wrinkles and not enough years left to waste another day waiting for permission. He turned back around. He didn't run. He didn't storm in. He simply walked, right toward the parade. Not toward a float, not toward a seat, but straight into the street. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't looking for applause. He just knew where he was supposed to be. He had earned this. He had bled for it. And whether or not his name was on the list, that street belonged to him too. So he stood. And that's when the sun hit his medals. And that's when the crowd turned. And everything changed. At first, no one knew what they were looking at. Just an old man standing still in the middle of the street. The brass band kept playing. Drums rolling, tubas thumping, cymbals clashing, until a child sitting cross-legged on the curb pointed at the silver glint flashing from the man's chest and tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, that man has medals." The father looked up from his phone. His eyes narrowed at first, squinting against the sun. Then they widened. 3 rows of medals. Silver Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross. Not just a veteran, a warrior. The kind you read about in history books, the kind school assemblies speak of in past tense. The father stood. One by one, heads began to turn. First a small ripple of murmurs, then a wave of silence that started at the edges and crept inward like a hush falling on a church. The band faltered, unsure if they should continue. A cymbalist froze mid-swing. The drum major slowly lowered her baton. Walter stood still. Not in defiance. Not in protest. Just presence. He didn't say a word. His eyes scanned the crowd, not with pride or bitterness, but with the quiet patience of someone who had waited years for this moment without ever knowing if it would come. A man in a sheriff's uniform stepped forward, whispering into his radio. The parade director hustled toward Walter from the side, tie flapping in the wind, clipboard still in hand. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake," the man said, breathless. Walter gave a faint nod. "I know. You're not supposed to be." "I was invited," Walter interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I understand, but—" The director began again, only to be cut off by a deeper voice from behind. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd parted. A figure in full dress uniform approached, the sunlight glinting off his 4 stars. General Thomas Caldwell, recently retired but still sharp as steel and respected like law. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't wait to be introduced. He marched directly up to Walter and saluted. Full, crisp, military regulation. Walter hesitated for a moment, then returned it. A bit slower, a little more stiff, but no less dignified. Then General Caldwell turned to the director. "This man served under my command. He took shrapnel for this country. He bled in silence, came home without fanfare, and kept serving in ways you'll never see on paper." I didn't know, sir," the director stammered. Caldwell stepped closer, voice now low but sharp. "You didn't ask." A gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. The general turned to Walter again. "Sergeant Jennings, would you do me the honor of leading this parade?" Walter didn't respond immediately. For a long second, the entire street held its breath. Then the old man nodded. He didn't smile, but his eyes shimmered. Caldwell gestured, and a spot at the very front of the formation opened up. 2 Marines, standing at attention, flanked the path. A local marching band shifted sideways to let him through. And as Walter stepped forward, cane tucked under his arm like a baton, a cheer erupted from the crowd. Not loud at first, hesitant, respectful. Then it grew. Claps turned to applause. Applause turned to standing ovations. People rose from lawn chairs. Hats came off. Flags waved harder. The whole town, the one that had overlooked him, was now watching every step. For the first time in years, Walter Jennings wasn't a footnote in someone else's celebration. He was the headline. Walter's steps were steady but measured. Not because of age or pain, though both were there. No, each footfall was deliberate, as though he were walking a path not just of asphalt but of memory. Every crack in the pavement felt like a page in a book that nobody else had read. A lifetime of service etched into silence. Behind him, the parade fell into rhythm, not the other way around. The marching band picked up a softer, more reverent tune. The cheerleaders lowered their pom-poms. Even the local high school's float paused just long enough to adjust its route, giving space to the man now leading the entire procession. Children pointed from the sidewalks. Parents explained in hushed tones. "That's Sergeant Jennings," one mother whispered to her daughter. "He served in 3 wars. That's why we get to have this parade in the first place." And slowly, the town remembered what it had never truly known. Just 3 blocks away, in the town museum's dusty archives, there was a framed black and white photo of a young soldier, standing tall, eyes sharp beneath the brim of a helmet. No name tag, no caption, just a date in the corner, 1968. It was Walter. The curators never knew who it was. Walter had never told them. He never wanted credit. He never asked for honor. But now, walking under the summer sky, he was finally receiving it. Not through medals, not through speeches, but through recognition that ran deeper. A man who gave without asking. A soldier who carried a nation's weight and returned to carry groceries for neighbors who never knew his story. As he passed the old courthouse, an elderly woman stood up from her folding chair and placed her hand over her heart. Her son had served, she'd said once, but never came back. Walter had stood beside her at the memorial wall every Memorial Day for 10 years. Never said much, just stood. She whispered, "Thank you," as he walked by. At the town square, Jason, the young man from the parade committee who had invited Walter in the first place, finally reappeared, panic written across his face. He'd just found out what had happened. Just heard that Walter had been turned away. He ran toward the front of the parade, unsure of what he'd find. But when he saw Walter, leading the entire town, medals gleaming, head held high, Jason froze. Walter caught his eye and gave a faint nod. No anger, no blame, just understanding. Jason's eyes welled. He stepped off the sidewalk and joined the line behind Walter without a word, walking one pace behind, as though to say, "You led us before. You lead us now." The parade looped down toward the river, past old shops and gas stations, each one with someone standing outside to watch, even those who'd never attended before. The barber shop owner saluted from the doorway. The grocery store clerk placed her hand over her chest. Every step Walter took echoed louder than the last, not in sound but in meaning. A man once denied the right to march now marched without needing permission. By the time they reached the end of the route, the crowd had gathered tighter, shoulder to shoulder. And when Walter stopped at the final bend near the war memorial, the procession behind him halted too. He turned toward the monument, eyes tracing the names carved into stone. His friends, his brothers, names most had forgotten but never him. He stood in silence. Then, for the first time all day, he raised his hand in salute. One last time. As the crowd behind him followed, a wave of respect sweeping through every corner of the square. And in that moment, the man they'd once overlooked stood taller than the monument itself. The square was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness, but the kind born from reverence. A silence so deep that even the birds seemed to pause their song. Walter remained still before the memorial, his hand slowly falling from the salute, resting by his side. For a second, he didn't move. He simply stared at the names etched into the granite, eyes scanning each one like an old friend. Behind him, the entire town stood waiting. No one urged him to move. No one tried to end the moment. They all just watched. Then, a single sound broke the hush. It wasn't a trumpet, nor a drum, nor a marching band. It was the soft clatter of boots on stone. General Caldwell stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, each step measured and firm. He stopped beside Walter, removing his cap with slow, deliberate grace, and placed it against his chest. "You marched alone for too long, Sergeant," he said, just loud enough for Walter, and the front few rows to hear. "Not today." Walter turned to him. "You didn't have to come. I wasn't about to let history forget a man who carried it on his back." They stood there together, two men from two generations, bound not by title or rank, but by understanding. And then, with a nod from the general, the band at the back of the parade struck up a new tune. Something slow, solemn, proud. The national anthem. The crowd rose as one. Hats came off again. Hands to hearts. Some sang, some didn't, but all listened. And when the final note faded into the summer air, the general did something no one expected. He turned toward the crowd and said, "Today, we honor the living, not just in spirit, but in presence." He gestured to Walter. This man was turned away at the gate, not because of who he was, but because we forgot to look past what we assumed. That ends today. I am ordering a new tradition. From this day forward, the Independence Day Parade will be led by the veteran in this town with the longest, most decorated record, and I believe we already know who that is. The crowd erupted into applause. This time louder, less reserved. This time they clapped like they meant it, like they were apologizing, celebrating, and correcting themselves all at once. Walter's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. He looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, all now united in a shared sense of something larger than themselves. Not patriotism painted in red, white, and blue for just a day, but a reminder of what those colors meant. That behind every parade and flag, there was a person who paid the price. Someone who came home quietly, carrying more than we'll ever know. As the crowd began to disperse, families came forward, one by one, to shake Walter's hand, to thank him, to ask questions they'd never thought to ask a veteran before. Children posed for pictures with him. Young soldiers saluted him. Even the mayor, flanked by news cameras, handed him a framed certificate proclaiming the day, Sergeant Walter Jennings Day. But Walter didn't care about the cameras, or the certificate, or the photos. What mattered most to him was the simple gesture from a little boy near the edge of the square. The same child who had first pointed at his medals now walked up quietly, holding something in his hand. It was a pin, one of those tiny plastic ones with an American flag. "I want you to have this," the boy said. "You're why I want to be a soldier one day." Walter took it with both hands, stared at it a moment, then gave a small smile, the first all day. "Make sure you serve for the right reasons," he said, "and never forget who came before you." As the crowd thinned, Walter sat down on a bench beneath a tree, metal ribbons catching the breeze. He watched the kids play, the veterans share stories, and the general giving interviews he clearly didn't care to give. And in that moment, with the sun setting behind the war memorial, Walter Jennings finally felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not just seen, not just heard, but truly understood. A forgotten hero no more. If the story moved you, share it. Honor the quiet heroes in your life, the ones who never asked for recognition, but deserve it most. And don't forget to subscribe to Endless Stories for more powerful true-to-life tales that remind us of the value of humility, service, and strength.